the imperial capital of Bianjing, winter of 1111. The city lay under a blanket of snow and smoke. Incense curled lazily in temple courtyards. Nobles sipped wine in painted pavilions, and out in the distance, a storm was silently gathering. Wang was just a girl of 14 then, not yet a wife, not yet a name in history. She stood by the frosted window of her family's residence. Embroidery needles suspended in the air. The silk cloth on her lap was half finished, but her eyes had drifted far beyond the stitches. What use was needlework, she wondered, when men outside were drawing the lines of history in blood and coin? Her family was part of the mid-tier scholarly class. Her father, a vice minister with a sharp tongue and a long memory, served in the bureaucratic maze of the Song dynasty. Her mother, a quiet woman of grace and piano hands, taught Wang poetry, etiquette, and silence. But Wang listened more keenly to the arguments drifting in from the tea room, where her father debated politics, war, and the emperor's obsession with art over governance. The emperor, Huizong, was a man more in love with brush strokes than borders. While the northern Jin tribes were mobilizing, he painted cranes and composed poetry. The court, ever refined, was woefully unprepared for the steel that approached from the steppes. Wang didn't care for court gossip. She was drawn to something else: ambition. She met Qin Hui during the spring planting ceremony at the academy, a ritualistic event where scholar officials pretended to bless the soil while secretly measuring each other's futures. Qin wasn't the most handsome man there, but he had something the others didn't: a calculated, cold fire in his eyes. When he read aloud an essay titled "Virtue is for the Weak," the senior ministers frowned in scandal. Wang, standing among the veiled daughters of bureaucrats, smirked. Later, a sudden drizzle forced them all under the same monastery roof. Beneath the sound of rain and rustling robes, Wang and Qin spoke for the first time. "You're bold," she said. "I'm alive," he replied. "What if boldness kills you? Then at least I die trying to live on my own terms." She studied him like one examines a chessboard, not for beauty, but for advantage. A year later, their families arranged the marriage. Her father wasn't impressed by Qin's lineage, modest, undistinguished. But in a time of quiet chaos, a mind like Qin's was a weapon. Wang did not object. On their wedding night, she whispered into his ear, "Do what you must, but never let someone else write the end of your story." Marriage was a political pact wrapped in silk. She helped him navigate the bureaucracy, analyzed court personalities, even drafted letters to regional officials in his name. He rose quickly. He was too clever not to, too ruthless to be patient. And Wang, she was not behind him. She was beside him. Then came the storm. In 1126, the northern Jin dynasty struck. The Song court panicked. Emperor Huizong abdicated in fear, passing the throne to his son, Zhao Huan. It didn't help. The Jin swept south like thunder, sacking cities, toppling generals. In Bianjing, the once glorious capital, the refined elite scrambled to burn paintings and melt down heirlooms for silver. Qin Hui was dispatched north as a diplomat to negotiate peace. Everyone knew it was a suicide mission. Before he left, he turned to Wang. "If I don't return," he said, "go south. Start over. Forget me." She looked him dead in the eye. "If I forget you, who will remember your name?" He never made it back. Captured by the Jin, he was thrown into a dungeon somewhere deep in the northern wilderness. Wang, meanwhile, stayed. She did not run. When the capital finally fell in an event history would call the Jinggang disaster, the new emperor Zhao Huan and thousands of nobles, officials, concubines, and scholars were taken as prisoners of war. Among them, Wang and Qin Hui. The forced march to Jin territory wasn't a transfer. It was a parade of humiliation. The elite of the Song were dragged through mud, snow, and spit. Women flung themselves from cliffs to escape captivity. The once proud bureaucrats begged for food from peasants. And Wang? She learned. She learned to speak the Jin tongue. She learned how fear works, not as an emotion, but as a system. She watched how the Jin broke spirits not with violence, but with survival. The ones who lasted were not the strongest, they were the ones who adapted. Wang saw her husband again after 2 months. They were allowed a brief reunion at a prison station near the border. He was thinner, colder, sharper. She hugged him through the bars. No tears. "We will return," she whispered. "But when we do, you cannot be who you were. Let them call you a traitor. You'll be remembered. But more than that, you'll have power. That was the night Qin Hui made his decision. The next spring Qin Hui was released. No one knew why. Not in the court at Linen, the new capital in the south, not in the army, not even the censors. It was not an exchange. It was not a pardon. Some believed he had betrayed secrets. Others whispered darker theories, that he had pledged allegiance to the Jin in a private, unspoken agreement, that he had become a bridge between empires. He returned to court. Wang did not. She remained behind in Jin territory for 6 more months. Why? To the records, no one knows. But unofficially, it was said she was learning languages, customs, networks, that she was meeting people in dark tents and snowy barracks, that she made promises to people who did not forget favors. When she finally walked through the gates of Linen, she was changed. Her silks were gone. She wore plain robes. Her hands bore burns from frostbite and rope. But her eyes were weapons. Qin Hui greeted her at the gates. He clutched her hand as if afraid she might vanish. She smiled, not warmly, but deeply. In public, they resumed their roles. Husband and wife, former captives, survivors. But in private, they began to write a new story, not just of survival, of conquest, not by sword, but by signature. And behind it all, a woman with no title, no rank, no line in the history books. Yet, the city of Linen was not Beijing. Where the old capital had been marble, calligraphy, and centuries of power, Linen was young. Uncertain, a southern fishing town hastily transformed into a capital by a government in exile. The Song dynasty had fled here in disgrace, dragging along what remained of its court, its traditions, and its illusions. But Wang saw something else in Linen. A blank page. There was no power structure yet, no entrenched lords, no invisible walls between the throne and the streets. In Beijing, families had ruled for generations. In Linen, survival wrote the rules. It was here that Wang and Qin began to rise, not with armies, but with influence. Qin was reappointed as a mid-tier advisor at first. Whispers followed him like shadows. Some called him a traitor for returning from Jin captivity unscathed. Others, more careful, watched with interest. After all, he brought information, insight, and connections the court desperately lacked. He knew how the Jin negotiated. He knew their generals by name. Most importantly, he knew fear and how to use it. But he was not alone. Behind every memo he submitted, every alliance he formed, there was Wang, listening in court halls behind screens, gathering rumors from palace maids, whispering warnings before meetings. She was not welcome in political spaces. Women were confined to tea, silk, and whispers. But Wang understood that in Linen, the real power wasn't spoken in open court, it breathed behind closed doors, over wine, beneath fans, between courtesans and concubines. So she entered that world deliberately. She began to frequent the homes of noble widows and retired scholars' wives. She joined embroidery circles, not for craft, but for conversation. Women talked, and Wang listened. She learned which general's wife hated the emperor's cousin, which palace maid was bedding a censor, which merchant funded which official's son. She stored it all. Wang did not trade in gossip, she traded in leverage. And soon her network extended across Linen like invisible strings. If someone sneezed at court, Wang knew whether it was a cold or a message. Qin began to act differently. He spoke more cautiously in council meetings, yet struck with more precision. When opponents rose, they found old scandals suddenly resurfacing. When allies faltered, they received just enough support to survive, but never enough to challenge him. People credited Qin, but Qin knew who guided his blade. They still met each night in private, like generals reviewing battle maps. But their maps were people. Their weapons were secrets. Why not push harder? Qin asked one night, pacing their study. The emperor's weak. The court's divided. I could take the chancellorship within a year. Wang, sitting by the candlelight, held up a single finger. Because fast power breaks, she said. What we build must bend, never snap. She was right. In 1130, a coup attempt by a rival faction nearly toppled the emperor. It failed, but it shook the capital. The survivors? Those who had prepared in silence, like Qin. In the aftermath, the emperor promoted him to deputy minister of war. Wang said nothing that night. But when Qin returned from the palace, she poured him wine without a word, a silent signal between them. Step 1 was complete. That winter, Wang's influence deepened. A new group had begun to emerge in court, the peace faction. They argued that the Song dynasty should stop fighting the Jin, accept territorial losses, and stabilize the realm. Better a crippled empire than a dead one, they said. Their opponents, the loyalist faction, were led by General Yue Fei, a hero of the people. You had never surrendered, never compromised. He had clawed back cities, inspired peasants, and become the symbol of resistance. To many, he was the last hope of restoring the North. To Wang, he was a threat, not because of what he did, because of what he symbolized. People who fight for ideals, she told Qin, don't compromise. They don't negotiate, and they don't forget. But he's loyal to the Song, Qin argued. Yes, Wang said softly. To the Song that was, not the one we're building. She began studying Yue Fei like a general studies terrain. His letters, his poetry, even his food preferences. She sent gifts to his staff under false names to see who accepted bribes and who returned them. She mapped his network and found it frighteningly clean. He can't be bought, she said one night, staring into the fire. Then, Qin asked. Wang looked at him. Her voice was calm but final. Then we break him. It was not a decision made in rage. It was strategy. By 1132, Qin Hui was appointed chancellor. He publicly proposed a peace treaty with the Jin, a deeply unpopular move, seen by many as a betrayal. But the emperor backed it. He feared more war, more rebellion. Qin's voice became the emperor's shield. Yue Fei opposed it openly. The people loved you. They cheered his victories, sang his poems. He was a living legend. And Wang began to erase him, not with blades, with questions. She arranged for quiet rumors. Yue Fei is too ambitious. He disobeys orders. He dreams of ruling the North alone. She never said these things herself. She let them bloom like mold in silence. She published anonymous pamphlets. Had merchants speak of Yue's pride. Had courtesans mock his rigid morals. One mistake, Yue's mild criticism of the emperor in a private letter, was leaked, exaggerated, and twisted. Qin feigned concern. Wang wrote the script. By 1136, Yue Fei was recalled from the front. When he entered Linen, he was not welcomed. He was watched. His men were scattered. His friends were investigated. His name, once sacred, became dangerous. And Wang watched from her courtyard, calm and composed, as the last symbol of resistance was slowly stripped bare. I don't hate him, she told a maid once. But the empire has no place for heroes, only survivors. The war for power was never about ideals. It was about architecture which systems could last. Wang wasn't trying to destroy a man. She was trying to build a dynasty. The arrest came at dusk. General Yue Fei had just returned from visiting his mother's grave outside the southern gates. His boots were still muddy when the imperial guards surrounded his estate. He did not resist. He didn't have to. The accusation itself, treason, was enough. The streets of Linen grew silent. No citizens protested. No officers stood in his defense. Not because they believed the charges, but because the system had already been rewritten from loyalty to obedience, from memory to survival. In the palace, Qin Hui received the arrest order with a studied expression of reluctance. The emperor avoided eye contact. The ministers nodded quietly. It was done. In the courtyard of their estate, Wang sat beneath a plum tree in full bloom. The petals fluttered around her like a snow of silk. She sipped tea as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A maid approached, trembling. They've taken him. Wang didn't look up. I know. What will happen to him, madam? Wang set her cup down gently. He will become a lesson. In prison, Yue Fei refused to confess. Interrogators came and went. Pressure was applied, not with torture, but with time. Isolation. False letters. Lies that his army had betrayed him. Lies that his family was in danger. None worked. He scratched a poem into the wall of his cell with a broken tile. Loyal heart, I left behind, in mountains cold and clear. Wang read the transcript herself days later. He's still playing the hero, she told Qin. Then we can't kill him, Qin replied. Wang raised an eyebrow. Why? Because martyrs never die. They multiply. Wang nodded slowly. She knew the truth of it. You don't destroy legends by force. You let them decay. But the emperor was growing paranoid. Court tension was thick. Something had to give. A letter was forged. No one ever found the original. No one ever saw a seal. But it circulated through the inner court, a supposed confession, vague and damning. Qin presented it with a bowed head. The emperor signed the execution order with trembling hands. And on a cold morning in January 1142, Yue Fei was led to a private courtyard behind the prison and silently beheaded. No procession. No trial. No witnesses. Just a sword, a nod, and history erased with blood. In the days that followed, rain fell on linen for a full week. The city's gutters ran red with plum blossoms. Publicly, the court claimed Yue Fei had died of illness. Privately, everyone understood the last true symbol of resistance was gone. And Wang? She wept once. Not for you, but for the part of herself that still believed in heroes. I used to think, she said to Qin that night, that we were carving out a new world. Now I realize we're simply the ones left standing. Qin looked at her across the candlelit room. He had become the most powerful man in the empire, second only to the emperor. And yet he looked tired, more shadow than flesh. Does it matter? He asked. Wang smiled. Of course it matters. Because history will remember him. She stood, walked to the balcony, and looked out over the city. But it will never forget us. In the years that followed, peace with the Jin was formalized. The southern song stabilized. Trade resumed. Culture blossomed. And the names of the dead faded one by one. Wang withdrew from public circles. She no longer attended gatherings. She declined invitations. But behind closed doors, she remained the architect. She funded orphanages discreetly, supported widows of soldiers quietly. She read philosophy late into the night, especially Han Fizi and Zhuangzi. She wrote letters that vanished into the archives. She walked the gardens alone. One day, she found a statue in a back alley of linen. A clay figure of a man kneeling, hands tied behind his back. No name, no plaque. She bought it and placed it in her study. When Qin asked why, she said to remind us. Of what? That power is never clean, and history never kind. That winter, she sat alone by the fire, pen in hand, brush trembling slightly. She began writing a letter, not to the emperor nor a minister, but to someone in the future. If you read this, you will not understand. You will judge. You will condemn. And you will forget that we chose survival, not glory. That we loved our country even as we cut it open to save its heart. She folded the letter, burned it, and watched the ashes curl upward like smoke from a dying empire. They arrived in Jin territory just before the first snow. The caravan of captives stretched for miles, a river of broken robes and bent backs. Behind them, the capital of Bianjing smoldered in ruins. Ahead, silence. Only the crows seemed to sing. Wang did not speak on the journey. Not when the concubines wept in the dark. Not when a former minister tried to bribe a guard and was beaten half to death. Not even when she saw children sold along the road for a handful of millet. She watched. The Jin did not govern like the song. There were no elaborate rituals, no poetic oaths, no courtly flattery. The Jin ruled with clarity, cruelty when required, discipline always. There were no masks here, only results. That clarity seduced her. It horrified her too at first. When she was separated from Qin and locked in a cold mud brick building with 60 other women, she almost broke. There were no names in the barracks, only numbers. Her comb was taken, her silks shredded, her books burned. Every morning began with silence, cold porridge, and drills like livestock. But still she watched. The other women, daughters of officials and wives of generals, wept endlessly. Some refused food. Others screamed prayers to ancestors who never answered. Wang stayed quiet. She observed the guards. Noticed which ones moved first, which ones shouted, and which ones simply stared. And slowly, she began to speak. Not often, not loudly, but just enough to learn. She bartered words for warmth, offering to write poetry in the Jin tongue in exchange for a blanket. When one of the older women collapsed with fever, she helped clean the wounds, earning a rare nod from the matron in charge. She learned to walk like a servant, to speak like one of them, to see her name as an inconvenience, not an identity. But her mind never forgot. In the 3rd month, she was selected to serve in the outer compound of a Jin commander, a man called Sheila. He was not unkind. He was not kind. He was precise. Wang cleaned his study, arranged his scrolls, prepared tea, and listened, through paper-thin walls and whispered reports. She began to reconstruct the Jin hierarchy. Sheila was a mid-level tactician, respected but not feared. He despised the scholars of song and mocked their poetry governance but admired their systems. He wrote notes in the margins of song law books, notes Wang silently memorized. One evening, Sheila left the study early. Wang stayed behind and opened his ledger. She didn't steal it. She didn't even touch it. She just read. For 2 hours, she stood silently in the candlelight, absorbing troop deployments, tax maps, even ambassadorial schedules. When she heard footsteps outside, she closed the book and resumed sweeping. That night, she began drawing her own maps in the dirt beneath her cot. Not of cities, of people. She mapped which guards visited which couriers. Which women in the barracks whispered to which officers. Which names came up in conversation again and again. She wasn't looking for revolution. She was looking for leverage. Because she knew. Eventually, there would be a way out. And when that moment came, only those with knowledge would survive. In the Jin compound, information moved like water, silently, persistently, shaping everything beneath the surface. Wang became a current. By her second year in captivity, she was no longer treated like a prisoner, not officially. She was attached to the household of Commander Sheila, who often traveled between the occupied northern cities and the Jin court in Shangjing. She was assigned to logistics, but her true role was harder to define. Somewhere between translator, scribe, and shadow. Sheila was a man obsessed with systems. He saw in Wang not just utility, but an experiment. A songwoman with a keen mind raised in the decadent bureaucracy of the South. He asked her questions over tea, about taxation, about legal precedent. About how the song maintained such a vast scholar-official class without rebellion. Wang always answered honestly, or rather, precisely. She gave him truths wrapped in philosophy. She quoted Confucius not as a moralist, but as a manager. She cited Han Fizi to show the brilliance of structured fear. She even once said, over a cup of chrysanthemum wine, the strength of the song was never its sword. It was that everyone believed the empire was an idea worth preserving. Your empire is feared. Ours was worshipped. That's why it fell so quickly. Worshippers are the first to despair. Sheila had stared at her for a long time that night, then asked if she would join him on his next diplomatic visit to a vassal city. She said yes. It was the first time she saw the Jin leadership up close. They were not barbarians. That had been a lie told in song tea rooms. They were horseborn generals who sat on carpets instead of thrones, who drank blood wine and discussed philosophy in the same breath as conquest. They respected discipline, admired cunning, and detested sentimentality. To them, Wang was exotic, a scholar woman from the soft South who could recite laws and explain tax tables in 2 languages. But she knew what they really saw, a tool. So she became one. She translated reports that subtly emphasized the fracturing morale in the South. She corrected ledgers in ways that made linen seem purer than it was. She painted the image of a fractured song court, all of which was true. Mostly, and she wrapped these truths in a tone that implied not defiance but opportunity. She wasn't betraying her country. She was preparing to return to it, only this time on her terms. It was during one of these diplomatic visits that she heard Qin's name again for the first time in a year. A Jin advisor, drunk and indiscreet, muttered, "That song man we released. Qin something. Still useful. He sends word back through the merchants." Wang's cup froze in her hand. Still useful. So Qin was alive. Not just alive, active. And being used. Was he cooperating? Was he lying? Was he trapped? Or was he playing the same game she was? That night, she wrote a letter. Not to him. She couldn't. But to a merchant known to travel between Shangjing and Linen in careful, coded metaphors about rice harvests and old debts. She asked a single question: did the black fox return with both eyes intact? 3 weeks later, she received a bundle of silk from the merchant. With a small symbol stitched into the lining, a mountain split by a single stream. A sign only she and Qin would recognize. It meant, I remember. I wait. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply sat under the moon that night, writing plans into the sand with her finger, watching the wind erase them as quickly as she formed them. She knew then they would return. But first, She needed leverage. And in the north, leverage was trade. The Jin relied on trade with the southern Song more than they admitted. Their iron was crude, their artisans untrained. Their tax system still reliant on loot and tribute. And most of all, their political factions were beginning to divide between those who wanted to keep the war going and those who preferred a puppet Song regime in the south to milk for silver. Wang inserted herself into that fracture. Using her reputation, her connections, and the trust she had built, she began writing anonymous position papers, left accidentally in the quarters of generals and bureaucrats. These memos argued for a softer, subtler strategy. Release key prisoners. Support moderate Song factions, divide their enemy from within. None were signed, but every single one moved up the chain. A few weeks later, Sheila summoned her. He asked her, straight-faced, "If we released you and your husband, what would happen?" Wang didn't answer immediately. She poured the tea first, then looked him in the eye. "You would not be remembered as the conquerors who destroyed a dynasty. You would be remembered as the ones who created a new one. Through us." There was silence, long enough to feel like a verdict. Then Sheila simply said, "I will speak with the court." 3 weeks later, Qin Hui was summoned by a Jin envoy. And 3 months after that, he was released. Back to Linen. Alone. The court in Linen was too fractured, too desperate to question his return. He was received quietly, assigned a minor position, and told to keep his head down. But he didn't. Because Wang hadn't returned yet. And he knew what that meant. She wasn't done. Linen had changed. When Wang stepped through its south gates, escorted by a modest envoy of traders and diplomats, it felt like stepping into a memory that had been rewritten by someone else. The city had grown, wider, denser, noisier, but it lacked the iron soul of Bianjing. Its palaces were hastily converted villas. The court buildings looked like they had been repainted one too many times. The stone lions outside the central ministry had cracks sealed with wax. But the air still smelled of politics. That much hadn't changed. Wang's arrival wasn't announced. There was no fanfare, no procession. She wore a plain robe, not unlike a merchant's wife. Her hair was tied simply. Her face, though aged by wind and discipline, bore no trace of weakness. But her eyes? They saw everything. Qin met her in a private garden behind their assigned quarters. The reunion was silent at first. He bowed. She bowed lower. Then he took her hands, gently, like a man afraid to wake a dream. "I thought," he began. She placed a hand over his mouth. "You waited." "That's enough." They didn't speak of the years apart, not yet. There were too many eyes on the windows, too many ears in the walls. Instead, they resumed their rhythm like dancers returning to a forgotten choreography. By nightfall, they had already reviewed the current court structure. Which factions had risen? Which families had shifted? Which ministers had gone missing? Qin had kept his head low during her absence, rising just enough to matter, never enough to threaten. That was about to change. Wang didn't come back empty-handed. She brought with her information, intelligence on Jin troop deployments, command rivalries, trade dependencies, even names of mid-ranking Jin officers who had taken bribes. But more than that, she brought a narrative, a way to reframe their return not as surrender, but strategy. She called it the doctrine of division. The basic premise was simple. The Song would never defeat the Jin by war alone, but it could divide them, bribe some, empower others, create internal contradictions. Use trade, diplomacy, ideology, tools sharper than any sword. She wrote it all down in refined, rhythmic classical Chinese, the kind used in imperial petitions. Qin submitted it under his name. It reached the emperor's court within a week. Reactions were mixed. The war hawks, especially Yue Fei's allies, called it treason wrapped in poetry. But the emperor? He read it 3 times and asked to meet the author. Qin went alone, of course. He delivered a flawless explanation, blending personal regret, national urgency, and political realism into a single, compelling performance. The emperor, exhausted from years of war and ineffectual governance, listened in silence. He asked only one question at the end. "Do you believe the people will forgive this?" Qin replied, "Your Majesty, people do not need to forgive policy. They only need to survive it." And with that, the first brick was laid. Within months, Qin was promoted to Deputy Minister of Rights, a modest post, but one tied to foreign affairs. He was assigned to manage correspondence with the Jin, a position of subtle leverage. Wang never entered the palace. She worked from behind, as always. But now she was more than a strategist. She was becoming a myth. Rumors began to circulate that Qin's wife had survived the north with nothing but her mind. That she spoke Jin better than a native. That she knew secrets about the emperor himself. None were true. All were useful. In the evenings, she resumed her old habits. She held salons in their home, inviting the widows of ministers, scholars' daughters, and retired palace staff. On the surface, it was embroidery, poetry, song. In truth, it was intelligence gathering. These women knew everything: who bribed which eunuch, which censor drank too much, which generals were buying homes near the border. Wang didn't gossip. She mapped. And when needed, she whispered. Once, a particularly vocal opponent of Qin's was set to give a fiery speech denouncing the peace strategy. 2 days before, a letter unsigned reached his wife, detailing her brother's gambling debts and certain indiscretions with household staff. The speech never happened. Wang didn't write the letter herself, but she ensured the information was delivered. This was how she moved, not with proclamations, but with presence. By the end of that year, Qin had become Minister of War. The whispers grew louder. Too fast, some said. Too easy. But the emperor had no better alternative. And Qin was careful, respectful, always acting on behalf of the throne, never ahead of it. Wang made sure of that. One evening, as they sat beneath a lantern in their private study, Qin asked, "Do you ever regret it? The path we've taken?" Wang was quiet for a long time. Then she stood, walked to a scroll cabinet, and pulled out an old map, drawn in her own hand, smuggled from Jin territory, frayed at the edges. She laid it between them. "This," she said, tapping the map, "is how empires move." He looked at her. "Lines on paper?" "No," she said. "Lines in minds. You can't hold them. You can only believe in them. And bend them." She paused. "And if enough people believe what we believe, then it becomes truth." He touched her hand. "We're not villains." "No," she agreed. "We're authors." The candle flickered. Outside, linen hummed with life. Inside, the future had begun. He rode into linen under a sky too blue for betrayal. General Yue Fei had just returned from the northern front after reclaiming 3 strategic cities from the Jin. His banners were torn, his armor dented, but his eyes burned with the righteous fire of a man who had stared defeat in the face and refused to blink. The streets erupted. Citizens poured into the boulevards. Poets wrote stanzas in real time. Peasants knelt by the thousands. Mothers lifted their children onto rooftops to catch a glimpse of the man W. Ho had done what no one else could, pushed back the invaders. In the palace, the emperor applauded with polite discomfort. In the Ministry of War, Qin Hui said nothing. And in a quiet chamber behind a lacquered screen, Wang wrote 4 words onto a piece of silk. "The sun is too bright." She folded the cloth, sealed it in wax, and handed it to a courier without a word. Yue Fei was many things: a warrior, a poet, a son. But what made him dangerous wasn't his sword. It was his clarity. He believed the song could be whole again, that the fallen capital could be retaken, that loyalty and virtue, if held tightly enough, could bend the arc of history. He didn't play politics because he believed in righteousness. That made him, to Wang, the most dangerous kind of man. Not corruptible, not persuadable, not even killable, not in the ordinary sense. A man like Yue Fei didn't die with his body. He lived in the minds of the people, which meant if he was to be neutralized, he would need to be unwritten. And that process had already begun. The first strike was silence. No formal ceremony welcomed him. His victories were noted, but not praised. Ministers bowed without enthusiasm. Invitations to recite poetry or dine with court officials were mysteriously delayed. Then came the questions. Whispers in tea houses. Why did Yue Fei return just now? Why had he refused direct orders in the north? Was it true he had grown close to local warlords? Did he want to retake the capital or to rule? Wang orchestrated none of these rumors directly. She simply allowed certain people to overhear the right phrases, ensured the right court scribes were well paid, and reminded key noble wives that silence could be expensive. Then she did something even more radical. She praised him. in private, to allies. It's a shame, she said softly to the wife of a southern merchant prince, that the general is too pure for this world. He doesn't understand what peace costs. The effect was subtle but lethal. By praising Yue Fei's virtue, she made him untouchable, but also untouchable in the political sense. A relic, an idealist, a figure of admiration, not inclusion. The emperor began to waver. I owe him much, he told Qin Hui during a private session. You owe the empire more, Qin replied. A letter soon arrived addressed directly to the emperor. Its origin was anonymous. Though Wang had spent 3 nights composing every line, it warned of a general whose men followed him more closely than the throne. A hero whose name had become louder than law. It ended with a simple question. What happens to a kingdom when the sword no longer bows to the crown? The emperor did not answer. But 3 days later, he summoned Qin Hui with new orders. Recall him, the emperor said. Bring him in. No charges. Just contain him. Qin bowed and passed the message to his wife that night. He won't resist, Wang said. How do you know? Because he's still trying to be loyal. And he was. Yue Fei returned again, this time without banners. Without cheers. Without poetry. He did not protest the recall. He said simply, if the court commands, the general obeys. Wang read the transcript of that statement over tea, then burned it. It's too clean, she told Qin. Too perfect. It's martyrdom. So what do we do? He asked. She looked out the window, where plum blossoms were starting to bloom. We let the flowers fall on their own. Yue Fei was not a man who feared dungeons. But confinement came in subtler forms. He was not arrested. He was not humiliated. He was simply sidelined. His sword was taken for ceremonial polishing. His men reassigned. His reports went unanswered. His requests to return to the front were under review. The empire, which had once knelt to him, now led politely and closed its gates. He felt it first in the court corridors, how footsteps no longer paused when he passed. Then in the letters from his old comrades, kind, vague, empty. Then in the silence that bloomed in his house Ike mildew. He still wore his armor each morning. But no one called him. No one came. And Wang watched. She watched as his strength, built from battlefields, honor, loyalty, became the very chain that bound him. He would not rebel. He would not flee. He would wait, because that's what good men did. He thought virtue had a weight that would tip the scale. He didn't see that the scale had already been recast. The second strike was redefinition. Wang didn't accuse him. She invited him. Through Qin, she arranged for Yue Fei to sit on a council of peace, a polite, elegant way to neuter him politically while appearing respectful. The general arrived dressed in full armor, even though the meeting was civil. A silent protest. Wang had already scripted the agenda. Topics included reparations, the logistics of trade resumption, and a proposal for military downsizing. Yue Fei objected predictably. He said, the peace is temporary. The North is not lost. We should rebuild the army, not dismantle it. Polite smiles. A few scribes quietly recorded, overzealous, disruptive to peace building. Later that night, Wang adjusted the phrasing in the official records herself. She replaced overzealous with disloyal, disruptive with insubordinate. Not lies, just suggestions. The third strike was legacy. Wang knew that Yue Fei didn't fight for power. He fought for the memory of a united song, for his ancestors, his sons, his fallen comrades. His soul was tied not to politics, but to posterity. So she went after that. Through artists, poets, historians, many of whom owed favors, money, or positions, she began to reshape the narrative. A new poem circulated anonymously. The sword that gleams too brightly blinds the throne. The hand that grips too tightly breaks the peace. It never mentioned Yue Fei. It didn't need to. Soon, even commoners began to murmur, why won't he let go? Why won't he rest? Wang had inverted the image. He was no longer a protector of the realm. He was an obstacle to healing. One night, Qin returned home visibly shaken. He knows, he said, pouring himself wine with trembling hands. He looked at me across the court today. Didn't say a word. Just looked. Wang took the cup from his hand. Let him look, she said. He was my friend. No. He was your rival dressed as a friend. and he would have never let us build the peace we need. She paused. Do you regret it? Qin didn't answer, because he already knew regret had no place in architecture. Not when you were rebuilding an empire. 2 weeks later, an unsigned letter appeared in the emperor's chambers. It detailed concerning communications between Yue Fei's camp and a northern rebel faction. It cited independent witnesses and intercepted letters. None of it could be verified. But the emperor, weary and isolated, called for an inquiry. It wasn't an arrest. It was a pause for clarity. And Wang knew that was the fourth and final strike. Yue Fei was summoned again to the palace. He came in silence. No armor. No horse. Just robes and sandals. This time, no one opened the gates. He waited under the eaves as rain began to fall. Not the thunderous kind that washed away memory, but the steady kind that soaked into bones and made the world heavy. He was led not to the council chamber but to a quiet courtyard behind the inner hall. There Qin awaited him. Wang had insisted on staying behind. She didn't need to be there. This was the moment for men to look each other in the eyes. What have I done? Yue Fei asked. You failed to do one thing, Qin said, not meeting his gaze. What? Bend. The silence between them was thick, bitter. Yue Fei turned, looked at the gray sky, and whispered, 10 years of blood and ice. For this. Qin swallowed. You are the last hero of a dead world. Yue Fei laughed. Not cruelly. Not even angrily. Just tired. Then what are you? And Qin, voice barely audible, said, the man building the next one. Later that night, Wang stood alone in their garden, watching the lanterns in the city flicker one by one as the wind picked up. She felt no joy, no triumph, just necessity. Qin joined her, his face unreadable. You've made me the most powerful man in the empire, he said. No, she replied. I made you the one who can't stop. She turned to him. Tomorrow we begin the hardest part. What's that? Making sure no one remembers him as a victim. There was no trial, no courtroom, no defense, no declaration of guilt. Only a paper, a seal, and a sunrise. The imperial edict arrived sealed in crimson wax, stamped with the jade seal of the emperor himself. The wording was as vague as it was deadly for crimes of insubordination and disruption of imperia. Harmony. The order required no explanation, only a location, a private courtyard behind the Office of Internal Affairs. Yue Fei, loyal to the end, did not resist. When the guards came to escort him, he bowed to them not as enemies but as men doing what duty demanded. He even apologized for the rain. His shoes were already soaked and he worried they might slip on the stone steps. He carried no weapon. He wore plain robes. On his chest, under his clothes, were 4 characters inked in his own hand. Jin Zhong Bao Guo, utmost loyalty to serve the nation. That morning, Wang did not eat. She sat by the window watching the steam rise from untouched tea, counting every bell chime from the temple nearby. She knew the time it would take to walk from the prison to the courtyard. She knew the weight of the blade. She knew who the executioner was, a former soldier from the western provinces, chosen specie. Fickly because he had never served under Yue Fei. Qin returned just past dawn. He did not remove his boots. He did not speak. Wang stood, walked to him, touched his face. He collapsed into her arms like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. It's done, he whispered. She said nothing. There were no congratulations in this war. Only survivals. News of Yue Fei's death spread like smoke, not seen, but smelled. The official statement claimed he had died from an illness of the heart, a poetic euphemism that pleased no one and confused everyone. Among the people, disbelief reigned. How could he die so suddenly? Was it grief? Was it betrayal? The streets did not riot, but neither did they sing. Wang had prepared for this. She knew the danger was not the act, it was the aftermath. A martyr could undo everything. So she moved quickly. First came the flood of poems, carefully written, elegantly sorrowful, but subtly critical of Yue Fei's rigidity. They suggested he was noble but unyielding, brave but blind to politics, glorious, but ultimately destabilizing. Second came the edicts, praising the army for its role in securing peace and announcing reforms in his name, twisting his image into a banner for policies he would have hated. Third came the statues, not of Yue Fei, of peace. Garden pavilions, stone lanterns, temples, all dedicated to the harmony of the new dynasty. His name was etched into none of them. His presence reduced to footnotes. When one local shrine erected a stone tablet with his famous quote, "I serve the nation with utmost loyalty," Wang ordered a quiet revision. Loyalty to nation is shown through peace, not defiance. No protests were recorded. People were too busy surviving. And soon, too unsure of what they remembered. But memory is a strange thing. You can erase it from books. You can strip it from songs. But in kitchens, in camps, in bedtime stories, it lingers. One day, a street performer sang a ballad of an unnamed general who died betrayed by his king. A child in the crowd whispered, "Is that Yue Fei?" The performer said nothing, but the boy remembered. Wang knew she could not erase him completely, so she changed the battlefield. If they must remember him, she told Qin, let them remember him as a lesson, a man who could not adapt. Is that who he was? Qin asked. She stared into the flame of the candle between them. It's who we need him to be. Years passed. Peace such as it was held. Qin became the chancellor, the most powerful man in the southern song. Wang no longer hosted salons. She no longer walked the streets in daylight. Her world became one of sealed scrolls, muffled footsteps, and the quiet turning of history. But every year, on the anniversary of Yue Fei's death, she lit a single stick of incense at dawn. No prayers, no words, just smoke, rising, as if to say, "We survived, and that must be enough." They called it peace, but Wang knew better. What held the southern song together was not unity, it was exhaustion. Not harmony, but managed decline. After Yue Fei's execution, the empire quieted. War fronts stabilized. The Jin grew content with tribute and trade. For a time, it seemed as if the South had won, not by sword but by strategy. And in the heart of it all sat Chancellor Qin Hui. And behind him, invisible yet inescapable, was Wang. She had no title, no statue, no seat at court, but no policy passed without her breath. She redesigned ministries, broke up old alliances, elevated obscure bureaucrats loyal to the doctrine of order. She made sure every provincial governor owed something, money, favor, or forgiveness. She called it distributed dependence. Never let a man feel secure in power, she told Qin once. Only in your permission to hold it. The emperor, once skeptical, now docile, had become a figurehead, willingly passive. He painted, composed poetry, visited temples, and left the machinery of empire to the chancellor. But not everyone accepted the new order. There were quiet rebellions, not of armies but of memory. Shrines to Yue Fei appeared in the countryside, carved into stone caves, etched in wood under bridges. Folk songs began to take on strange turns, praise of peace morphing into laments of heroes lost. Wang noticed. She always noticed. She responded not with fear, but with art. She commissioned plays state-funded, written by loyal scholars glorifying loyalty to the present. In these scripts, characters resembling Yue Fei were portrayed as tragic but misguided. Their deaths necessary for the greater good. It wasn't censorship. It was narrative management. A softer tool, far more permanent. Yet for all her control, Wang began to feel something shift. Not outside. Inside. It started with a dream. She stood in a flooded Bianjing. The old capital was submerged, stone lions half-drowned, lanterns floating like fireflies on the black water. And across the river stood Yue Fei, expressionless, untouched by the flood. He said nothing. She woke breathless, her hands gripping the silk blanket like a lifeline. She didn't tell Qin. He had changed too. Once sharp and calculating, Qin was now dulled by comfort. Surrounded by flatterers, he became cautious, indecisive. He second-guessed edicts Wang drafted. Hesitated at reassignments that might upset balance. "We have peace," he would say. "Why risk it?" And Wang would smile. But inside, she knew, peace without progress is a kingdom already rotting. She began meeting with younger ministers. Ambitious, hungry, restless. Men and women who saw the system as a ladder, not a temple. She mentored them, offered them secrets. Not about others, about themselves. "You will be great," she told one. "But not yet." "You will rise," she told another. "But only if you learn to kneel first." She wasn't building a faction. She was building insurance. One afternoon, during a garden stroll, Qin turned to her and said, "Do you ever wish we had done it differently?" She paused. "Done what?" "All of it. The war. The peace. Yue Fei. Wang plucked a falling petal from the air. Would we still be alive? He didn't answer. Would the empire? Still silence. Then what difference does wishing make? He nodded, but didn't meet her eyes. That night he drank alone in his study. She watched from the corridor, and for the first time in years, she felt the shadow of loss, not from others, but from him. Soon after, rumors of illness began. The Chancellor was not seen for days. His meals were returned untouched. His voice, when he did speak, carried the rasp of dry leaves. Wang called physicians. Sent for herbs, ordered silence. Qin would not die. He could not. Without him she would become a ghost, power without name, authority without shield. And worse, the emperor was beginning to stir. He had taken a new concubine, young, clever, from a family whose wealth rivaled half the provinces. This girl, it was said, asked questions. About ministers. About taxes. About who really governed the realm. Wang sent a gift, a gold hairpin, with a note. Better to be beautiful than curious. It was returned the next day, unopened. Wang smiled. War, it seemed, never truly ended. Qin Hui died in autumn. No grand announcement. No public funeral. Just a quiet mourning, a faded breath, and the end of a man who once held an empire in his palm. Wang was by his side. He did not speak in his final hour. He only looked at her, as if trying to remember the beginning, as if wondering whether everything that had followed had been a dream or a nightmare. She held his hand until it went cold, then let go. The palace sent an official mourner. A ceremony was conducted. The emperor offered perfunctory praise. The chancellor served the realm through great storms. But no statues were commissioned. No shrines were raised. And Wang, now a widow, became both more and less powerful at once. In the days that followed, she cleaned his study alone. Scrolls, ledgers, letters from other courts, all bound in ribbon and sent. She burned none of it. History, after all, was not the enemy. For a time, no one came. No ministers visited. No aides requested advice. The corridors that had once whispered her name now avoided it entirely. She had become dangerous. Not because of what she might do, but because of what she remembered. Because no one knew what she might choose to tell. Or when. That silence was her shield. And also her cage. The emperor, now in full maturity, changed. He spoke more confidently in court. He challenged advisors, rewrote tax codes, even took to reviewing military reports, something he had once considered beneath him. The concubine, the one who had returned the golden hairpin, became empress. Her family rose. They did not move against Wang directly, but one by one her allies were reassigned. Her protégés were offered higher posts if they disavowed her mentorship. A few refused. Most did not. She expected it. What she didn't expect was the forgetting. In court, when Yue Fei's name was mentioned, now cautiously restored as a martyr misunderstood, no one turned to her. In poems praising Qin's contributions to the state, her name was absent. In paintings of the Southern Restoration, she appeared only as a shadow, if at all, a background figure, face obscured, role unspoken. She had shaped the empire. But history was already sealing its doors. She tried, once, to write her own account. Not a memoir. A letter. A message to the future. We did not betray an ideal. We preserved a nation. We did not fear war. We feared chaos. And if we chose silence over glory, it was because silence outlasts. She folded it, sealed it, then placed it under the tile beneath her husband's chair. Not for others. Just for time. Years passed. One day, she walked through a public garden where children were playing near a stone monument. The monument was new, crisp, clean, freshly inscribed. She paused when she saw the name. General Yue Fei, loyal to the end. Flowers had been laid. Small paper cranes. No guard stopped them. No censor removed them. And for the first time in decades, Wang felt cold in her bones. Not because the world had changed, but because it had moved on. Later that evening, she returned home alone. She sat where Qin used to sit, in the far corner where light took longer to reach. And she whispered not to him but to herself. He won. She did not mean Yue Fei. She meant memory. It had survived all her edits. Outlived all her orchestrations. And now it was rewriting her. She died a year later, quietly, in her sleep. There was no scandal. No drama. No revenge. Just an old woman with too many secrets and no audience left. The palace sent no official notice. Her house was boarded up, her belongings inventoried, and the letter beneath the tile? Lost. Or perhaps still waiting. It begins with the kneeling statues. In a shaded courtyard beside the tomb of General Yue Fei, two figures made of iron bow eternally to the stone steps. Their heads are lowered. Their arms are bound. Rain has long since rusted their joints. Children toss pebbles at their backs. Tourists spit. There is no plaque for the woman. Just the one for her husband, Qin Hui, traitor. The woman beside him is simply his wife. That is how most people remember her. If they remember her at all. But memory is never so clean. Far north, in a temple no longer listed on maps. An old monk tends to scrolls older than dynasties. He knows her name, not as villain, not as shadow, but as architect. She saved more than she destroyed, he once told a student. But she destroyed that which people needed most to believe in. In another village, a retired scribe keeps a copy of a letter once attributed to her, unsigned, unsealed, hidden in the folds of a tax manual. The letter describes the death of Yue Fei not with cruelty, but with calculation. It ends not in justification, but a single line. To win without killing would have been kinder. But the empire does not offer kindness. Only outcomes. And in Linen, the city once hers, there is a wall where names of those who preserved the dynasty are carved in calligraphy. Her name is missing. But some claim if you visit at sunset, you can see faint brushstrokes beneath the stone. Painted, not carved. As if someone had tried, then changed their mind. History had no place for women like her. Not because they were weak, but because they were necessary. And necessity is rarely forgiven. After her death, her house remained sealed for 2 decades. It was eventually sold to a merchant family. During renovations, a floor tile cracked in the study. Beneath it, they found a sealed letter. They couldn't read it. The script was old, the dialect formal, the language cold and clear. The eldest son wanted to burn it. The daughter, a poet, kept it. She didn't publish it. She didn't even show it to anyone. But she read it, over and over. And in that letter, she met a woman who had no interest in being loved, only in being remembered by someone who understood. So what did the letter say? We don't know. But perhaps it said something like this. To the one who finds this, I was not born to rule. I was not meant to lead. I was trained to be silent. To serve, to preserve appearances while others wrote the world. But when fire came for our empire, I did not run. I walked into the inferno and I carried it in my hands. Yes, I killed legends. I unmade heroes. I rewrote what could not be undone. But in doing so, I saved millions who will never know my name. If I had chosen honor over survival, this empire would have been carved into a grave. You will call me cruel, cold, vicious. But I ask only this. When you speak of me, do not lie. Say that I chose. Say that I acted. Say that I saw what needed to be done and I did not look away. I do not ask to be forgiven. I ask not to be erased. In the end, it wasn't history that condemned her. It was forgetting. It was that she built a future that no longer needed her. And in that future, the stories needed saints and monsters. Not women with dirty hands who made impossible choices. Years after her death, scholars argued over what kind of woman she was. Some said she was Lady Macbeth reborn, a manipulator who whispered poison into a husband's ear, who turned policy into execution, who saw virtue and carved it out by the root. Others argued she was misunderstood, that she had merely done what the men around her dared not, protect the state by ending its illusions, that she had traded poetry for policy, loyalty for leverage, and in doing so, won a fragile peace. But history, in the end, prefers simplicity. So it named her a villain. She joined the long, dark gallery of dangerous women, queens, concubines, courtiers, who wielded the pen like a knife and were punished not for failure, but for success. The irony was sharp. She had succeeded too well. Her version of the empire held, until the next collapse. In private letters written by descendants of court ministers, her name appears as a caution. Beware the Lady Wang doctrine. Silence does not mean surrender. In rare theater performances, a mysterious female strategist often appears beside a king, never named, but always present when decisions must be made in shadows. And in quiet circles of historians, Some still say, she was not a monster. She was a mirror. A young emperor many generations later visited the courtyard where her iron statue knelt. Unlike the tourists, he did not mock it. He asked the historian beside him, "Did she do what they say?" The old man replied, "She did more, and she did less. She did what no one else would, and therefore, she carries the weight for all of them." The emperor stared for a long time, then whispered, "She looks tired." In a mountain town far from the capital, a woman tends to a library of forgotten texts. When asked who her favorite historical figure is, she says, "The woman who knelt beside the man everyone hated but who never bowed in her heart." And when the young ask why that woman's name isn't in the textbooks, she smiles sadly. Because history records power, but legacy remembers presence. So what became of Wang? Nothing. And everything. She became what she feared most. Forgotten. And what she hoped most. Unseen, but still shaping the spine of the empire long after her bones turned to dust.